Deep in the suffocating darkness of Thwindy Cave, Lily was just trying to scrape away centuries of filth to carve out a livable corner. Unaware she was standing on top of a fortune. The air was thick and damp, pressing against her lungs with every breath, heavy with the scent of wet stone and earth that had not seen sunlight in ages. As she hacked at the grime-caked limestone with her crude iron tool, each strike echoed hollow and lonely through the cavern. Dust rained down over her shoulders and into her tangled hair. Then, suddenly, the metal tip hit something that did not ring like ordinary rock. The sound was sharper, cleaner, almost musical. She paused, her heart stumbling in her chest. Slowly, she lifted her flickering lantern higher, expecting another stubborn ridge of stone mocking her efforts. Instead, the trembling light caught something buried within the wall. A vivid glimmer of electric blue, bright and impossible against the dull grey. Limestone. For a moment, she simply stared. Her brothers had laughed at her collection of worthless rocks, sneering whenever she returned from the ridge with her apron pockets sagging. But as Lily brushed the powdery dust aside with shaking fingers, more of that brilliant blue surfaced, glowing even in the lantern's weak light. The mountain was not barren. It was not empty. It was bleeding Yogo sapphires, stones as blue as a Montana summer sky. Bitterroot Valley, Montana, November 14th, 1898. The grey sky over the Bitterroot Valley poured down a freezing, unrelenting rain, as if the heavens themselves mourned. The downpour mirrored the heaviness that had settled over the Vance homestead like a burial shroud. Inside the sprawling, draught-triddled parlour, the air hung thick with the odours of damp wool coats, stale tobacco smoke, and the oppressive quiet of grief, or perhaps not grief at all, but anticipation. Old Elias Vance had been in the ground less than 24 hours. The earth above his coffin had not yet settled. And already his 3 sons, Caleb, Silas, and Jed, perched like patient scavengers on the plush velvet sofas, their sharp gazes locked on the frail lawyer seated across from them. Mr. Thaddeus's thin fingers trembled as he struggled with the wax seal of the envelope. The faint crackle of paper seemed deafening in the silent room. In the far corner, nearly swallowed by the shadow of a tall-backed armchair, sat Lily Dart. At 16, she appeared fragile enough to vanish if the wind blew too hard. Her pale face was framed by a simple black morning dress that hung loosely from her narrow shoulders, making her look smaller than she was. Her hands were folded neatly in her lap, fingers interlaced so tightly they trembled. Mr. Thaddeus cleared his throat, the brittle sound like dry leaves crushed underfoot. "To my eldest son, Caleb," he began, his voice quivering despite his effort to steady it. "I leave the homestead proper and the 300 acres of fertile bottomland along the river." Caleb, broad-shouldered, thick-necked, with a jaw like a shovel blade, and eyes stripped of warmth, leaned back slowly. A self-satisfied smile tugged at his mouth as he folded his arms across his chest, already settling into the role of master. "To Silas," the lawyer continued, adjusting his spectacles, "I bequeath the sawmill and exclusive logging rights to the northern timber ridge." Silas, thin and sharp-eyed, whose mind never ceased measuring profit against loss, gave a curt nod. That was where the real wealth lay, in timber and contracts and steady coin. And to Jed, Mr. Thaddeus went on, "I leave the entire herd of 2,000 head of cattle." Jed, red-faced and volatile, slapped his knee with a bark of laughter. He was already imagining the spring cattle drive, the clink of money changing hands. Then the lawyer hesitated. His gaze shifted toward Lily. Something like pity softened his features, and finally, the brothers stiffened. This was the moment. They had braced for the secret treasure, the heirloom silver, the hidden cache of gold. To my dearest daughter, my little Princess Lily. The words hung in the air. To Lily, I leave the parcel known as the Windy Cave, comprising 12 acres upon the eastern ridge. Silence crashed down over the room. Caleb let out a sharp, humorless snort. Windy Cave. Silas echoed incredulously. That heap of stone. Jed scoffed loudly. You can't grow ragweed on that cursed patch. 12 acres of nothing. He threw his head back, laughing harshly. Seems the old man finally lost his senses. Or maybe he knew exactly what you're worth, sis. A pile of useless rocks for a useless girl. Their laughter sliced through the room, jagged and merciless. They speculated Elias must have been fevered in his final days, or that he had saddled her with nothing but a tax burden. Lily did not move. She did not protest. She did not demand fairness. She sat perfectly still, her fingers laced so tightly her knuckles blanched white. The inheritance meant nothing. The land meant nothing. All she heard was her father's voice, warm and gentle, calling her my little princess, a voice now silenced forever. The ache in her chest was not envy. It was emptiness, a cavernous grief that hollowed her from within. To be an orphan among wolves was its own quiet sentence. She was not cast out. Not yet. She could still retreat to her small attic room, the one place in the house that carried the faint, lingering scent of her father's pipe smoke and the illusion of safety. But as her brother's laughter ricocheted off the cold walls, Lily felt the crushing truth settle over her. She was a single candle flame in a roaring storm, small, alone, poised at the edge of a harsh and unforgiving future. December 18th, 1898. Winter swept down upon the Bitterroot Valley without mercy, transforming the land into a frozen wasteland of iron-grey ice and cutting winds. Inside the Vance homestead, the chill deepened in more ways than the weather. The breaking point came a month later, on a night when a violent gale battered the windows, rattling them in their frames. Snow swirled like ash outside. Jed burst into the kitchen, stomping snow from his boots, shrugging off his coat with an exaggerated shake. His face twisted with manufactured fury. He claimed his prized ram, a valuable merino he intended to breed, had vanished from the barn. It was a lie. Or perhaps wolves had indeed dragged the animal into the dark. But truth was beside the point. Jed had long been coveting Lily's attic room. It was dry, insulated, and far superior to the leaking shed where he stored his saddle gear. Opportunity gleamed in his eyes. It was her, Jed spat, stabbing a calloused finger toward Lily, who stood at the stove scrubbing pots. I saw her near the tree line before the storm rolled in. She was hauling that ram toward town, likely hoping to sell it and make up for that worthless cave Daddy left her. The ladle slipped from Lily's hand, clattering loudly against the hearthstones. No, Jed, that isn't true. I haven't stepped outside all day. Her voice shook, thin and desperate. Caleb and Silas looked up from the table. They knew the accusation was false. Lily, slight and underfed, could not have dragged a stubborn ram 10 feet, let alone miles through a blizzard. But facts did not matter. This was the excuse they had been waiting for. We don't shelter thieves. Beneath this roof, Caleb said quietly, his tone low and dangerous as he rose from his chair, the legs scraping harshly across the floorboards. But I didn't, Lily pleaded, tears streaming down her face. She looked to Silas, hoping for a shred off logic, but he merely swirled the whiskey in his glass. A thief is a thief, Lily, and a liar is worse. We can trust you. The judgment was swift and brutal. Caleb didn't give her to pack a trunk. He grabbed her by therum, his grip bruising, and marched her to the back door. Jed threw a rough canvas sack at her, containing barely a change of clothes, and a stale loaf of bread, and shoved a flickering storm lantern into her hand. Get out. Jed sneered, the jealousy and resentment of a lifetime finally satisfied. Go, Livian, your precious rocks. They shoved her out into the black void and slammed the heavy oak door. The lock clicked shut with a finality that sounded like a gunshot. Lily stood shivering in the mud, fear-freezing rain instantly soaking her thin dress. The wind threatened to extinguish her dim lantern, her only defense against consuming darkness. She was utterly alone. Behind her, the warm glow of the windows felt like a taunt. Ahead, there was only the treacherous, muddy path winding up toward the desolate eastern ridge. With a sob caught in her throat, she turned away from the only home she had ever known. Clutching the lantern tight, she began the long, agonizing trudge toward the windy cave. She was no longer a princess. She was an outcast walking into the heart of that storm. The Windy Cave, Montana, late December 1898. The Windy Cave lived up to its wretched name. It was less a shelter and more a jagged scar in the mountainside, whistling with a constant, mournful draft that cut through Lily's wet clothes like a knife. She collapsed onto the stony floor, her teeth chattering so violently her jaw warped. The darkness here was absolute, heavy and suffocating. Panic threatened to seize her, but the primal instinct to survive kicked in. She fumbled with numbed fingers for the matches in her lantern. One match flared and died. Then another. On the third tree, a small yellow flame sputtered tolif, illuminating the damp grey walls. Lily scrambled to gather windbay, brown leaves and brittle twigs that had drifted near the entrance. She fed the tiny fire with the desperation of a drowning woman, coaxing it until it crackled. Outside, the howl of a coyote chode, the wind a chilling reminder of the predators stalking the night. Terrified, she dragged heavy stones to narrow the cave's mouth, building a crude barricade against the wild. Huddled close to the flames, watching her own shadow dance monstrously against rock, the dam finally broke. Why, Papa? She whispered into the emptiness, her voice cracking. You call me your princess. Why leave him a kingdom of dirt and ice? Thine justice of it burned hotter than the fire. It felt like a cruel joke, a betrayal from the grave. But the sun rose, and Lily didn't die. The following days were a blur of grit and exhaustion. The little princess was dead. In her place was a survivor. She learned to ignore the gnawing hunger in her belly. She ventured out into the beating frost to collect snow for water and scavenged for shriveled rose hips and pine nuts buried under the drifts. Yet, as the shock wore Off, something shifted. The silence of the cave, on so terrifying, began to feel like Ablasin. There was no shouting here, no cruel mockery from Caleb, no sly threats from Silas. For the first time in months, Lily breathed air that didn't taste of fear, driven by a need for better shelter from the draft. She decided to explore deeper into the cavern, holding her lantern high. She cleared away piles of debris and bad guano, moving toward the rear of the cave, where the air felt strangely still and slightly warmer. She wasn't just cleaning, she was claiming this desolate hole as her own. She was bending the unforgiving world to her will, unaware that her broom-off-wigs was about to uncover something that would change everything. Spring 1899. What Lily had found in the deep recesses of the cave wasn't just shelter. It was a vein of Yogo sapphires, stones as bluey as a Montana summer sky, embedded retento the limestone walls. But Lily wasn't foolish. She knew that if her brothers caught wind of a strike, they wouldn't just take the mine. They would bury her in it. So she played a dangerous game of shadows. Once a month, under the cover of a new moon, Lily disguised herself in oversized, rough-spun trousers and a sluice hat. She hiked 12 miles over Therridge to Hamilton, a town where Vivan's name held no sway. There she sold a single uncut stone to a discreet jeweler. Never enough to arouse a suspicion, just enough to buy survival. With the coin tucked in her boot, Lily began to transform her rocky prison. She didn't just survive, she nested. She purchased thick canvas, plain lumber, and most extravagantly, a pane of glass. She framed the cave entrance, sealing out the howling wind while letting thermiding light flood in. She bought a cast-iron stove that turned the damp cave-in into a warm, glowing sanctuary. But her greatest rebellion wasn't the comfort. It was the garden. The brothers had the rich bottomland, yet they grew only greed. Lily hated rocks, but she had a vision. She remembered how her father had always craved fresh strawberries, a crop Heckle never gets to take in the valley clay. Lily spent her days hauling heavy baskets of rich black loam up the steep slope from the creek bed, her back aching, her hands blistered. She filleted natural stone hollows outside her door with the soil, creating terrace planters. She planted the delicate arenas with the tenderness of a mother. There is no such thing as useless land, she whispered to the seedlings, wiping sweat from her brow. Only people who don't know how to love it. By late spring, the miracle happened. The grey, lifeless, windy cave was alive inside. The walls glittered with dun-mined sapphires. She used as decoration, turning the room into a sparkling guillot. Outside, the scent of pine was mixed with the sweet promise of fruit. Lily sat on her new porch, watching the sunset over her brother's distant, gloomy farmhouse. She was no longer the shivering girl kicked out into the rain. She was the queen of her own hidden kingdom, creating life where they said nothing could grow. She had found something better than an inheritance. She had found herself. Summer 1901.2 years had turned the Vance homestead into a graveyard of ambition. A relentless drought had baked the Bitterroot Valley into a cracked brown mosaic. Caleb's fertile bottomland was now a dust bowl. Silas's sawmill stood silent, bankrupt. and Jadess' once mighty herd had dwindled to a few skeletal cow chewing on dry sagebrush. The brothers sat on the porch of Theodkine farmhouse, their moods as foul as the stagnant air. Then the wind shifted. It didn't carry the usual scent of dry dirt or pine resin. Instead, a breeze drifted down from Theaston Ridge, carrying something impossible, the thick, intoxicating aroma of ripe fruit. It smelled like sugar and sunshine, driven by a mix of confusion and gnawing hunger. The three men stumbled up the rocky path toward the useless windy cave. As they crested Delfino Hill, they froze. The jagged grey scar of the landscape had vanished. In its place lay a miracle. Terrace rows of vibrant green. Leaves carpeted the rocky slope, dotted with housons of ruby-red strawberries welling with juice. It was an oasis in the middle of hell. The door to the cave opened and Lily stepped out. She was no longer the shivering rail-thin girl they had, thrown into the dark. She stood tall, her skin glowing with health, wearing a Cliancalico dress. She looked at her brothers, not with fear, but with Ackham, unshakable dignity. "Lily," Caleb croaked, his voice parched. "Hello, brothers," she said softly. Seeing an opportunity, the brothers put on their best smiles, smiles that didn't reach their eyes. "We were just coming to check on you," Silas lied, stepping forward. "Familishal'd stick together in hard times, right?" Lily didn't answer. She simply upon the door and gestured for them. "Tonta, if the garden was a shock, the interior of the cave was a revelation. It wasn't a dark hole. It was a home. A cast-iron stove radiated warmth. A sturdy oak table was set with porcelain, and shelves were lined with jars of crimson strawberry jam. But what made the brothers gasp were the walls. In the light of the oil lamps, the limestone glittered with a deep electric blue, afro, sapphires, gems. Lily had kept to beautify her sanctuary rather than sell. The brothers realized with a sinking, nauseating clarity that they had thrown away a fortune. They had cast out a Queen Tolive in a palace of her own making. "Lily," Jed stammered, his greed. Barola consoled. "This we can help you manage this. We can move back in, expand the operation. We're family." Lily walked to the table and picked up a woven basket filled with the largest, sweetest strawberries. She handed it to Caleb. "You may have of this," she said, her voice steady as Iroversto. "Eat and fill your belly sand." Then Caleb asked, stepping closer. "And then you will leave," Lily said. Their softness remained, but the still underneath was undeniable. "I can share my harvest, but I will not share my home. This life is what I built from the rocks you threw at me. There is no room here for people who do not know how to nurture." Her words did not rise in anger. They did not tremble. They settled into the air with calm certainty, like stones placed carefully one atop another. The brothers stood there, motionless. For the first time since their father's death, they had nothing to say, no sharp laughter, no cutting remark. The weight of what they had done, of what they had allowed themselves to become, pressed down on them heavier than any winter storm. The wind moved dust along the ground behind them, but inside the doorway of Windy Cave, the air was still. Slowly, almost awkwardly, they accepted the basket from her hands. It was filled with bread still warm from her stone oven, dried meat cured with patience, jars of preserves glowing ruby in the light, food grown from the very land they had mocked. sustenance. Drawn from the rocks they had called worthless. Shame flushed their faces. They had come expecting to see her broken. They had imagined hardship, bitterness, perhaps even desperation. Instead, they found strength. Not loud strength, not cruel strength, but steady strength, the kind that does not beg, the kind that does not need permission, defeated not by force, but by grace. They turned and stepped back into the dry valley wind. Their boots crunched against the gravel path as they walked away. Shoulders slightly bowed, Lily remained where she was, watching until their figures grew smaller against the wide Montana horizon. She did not call after them. She did not soften. Her stance. When they were nearly out of sight, she reached forward and gently closed the door. The sound was quiet. Final dot inside. Her fire crackled warmly against the stone hearth. The blue-veined walls of Windy Cave shimmered softly in the glow, the sapphires catching light like fragments of captured sky. The cave no longer felt like a wound in the mountain. It felt like a sanctuary. She moved back to her wooden chair and sat beside the fire, folding her hands in her lap, not in fear this time, but in peace. Through the small window she had carved into the rock, she looked out over her garden. Rows of red blossoms swayed gently in the breeze, bright against the rugged earth. Tomatoes, beets, and late autumn berries painted the soil with life. What had once been dismissed as barren land now flourished beneath her. Careful tending. She breathed in slowly. This was what her father had always wanted, not wealth measured in cattle or timber, but a place where she would be safe. A place where she could grow without being overshadowed. A place where her quiet resilience would not be mistaken for weakness. She had found it. She was safe. She was strong. And she was home. Question for the audience. Lily chose to forgive her. Brothers enough to feed them, but she didn't let them back into her life. Do you think she made the right choice by closing the door, or should she have given them a second chance? Let us know in the comments below. Outro, if Lily's journey from a useless outcast to the Queen of Windy Cave touched your heart, please hit that subscribe button for warm heart stories. We bring you emotional, inspirational tales every week. Don't forget to like and share this video. It helps us grow our own little garden here on YouTube. See you in the next story.